For our honeymoon resort, I sold off your mother's estate. The text message, "My new bride loves luxury," shone on my phone screen like a punch in the face. My screen was loaded with pictures of my husband Troy and his 25-year-old secretary Bethany, relaxing on immaculate Hawaiian beaches underneath it. Her diamond ring, which cost more than most people's automobiles and was purchased with money that should have been mine, was shining in the sunset as they sipped vibrant beverages while holding miniature umbrellas. I'm 47 years old, and my name is Karen Walsh. For 23 years, I thought I was married to a devoted spouse who helped me pursue my work as a cybersecurity expert at Phoenix, Arizona's Bellwin Digital. Oddly, I had spent decades creating security procedures, firewalls, and, oddly, shielding businesses from the very type of online crime my spouse had just perpetrated against me. He made reference to an inheritance in his writing, but it was more than simply money. It was my final interaction with my mother, who had died 6 months prior following a protracted fight with cancer. With shaking hands, I put my phone down and looked around the little flat that I now called home after Troy evicted me from our home 3 weeks prior. The same day he announced his engagement to Bethany, he issued me with divorce papers, saying I was emotionally unavailable and too preoccupied with my job. He failed to disclose that he had been plotting this treachery for months, methodically moving assets and closing accounts while I was preoccupied with taking care of my mother, who was near death. I didn't miss the irony that the man who had called me cold and cunning had planned the most deliberate treachery I could think of. Troy was reportedly making plans for his new life with a lady who was just slightly older than our daughter would have been if we had children, while I was holding my mother's hand in her last moments. My mother's roughly $200,000 bequest, which she had collected over the course of a lifetime of meticulous budgeting, was meant to assist me in rebuilding my life following the divorce. Instead, it was paying for Troy's romantic retreat with his new bride, a lady who made me shudder when she called him daddy and laughed at his jokes. Something dark and resolute sank in my chest as I continued to look through more pictures of their tropical paradise. Troy believed he was shrewd and untouchable due to his fundamental knowledge of financial and legal loopholes. However, he had overlooked one important fact about his soon-to-be ex-wife. I was among the finest in the field, not simply a cybersecurity professional. In contrast to him, I had a real understanding of how money flowed in the digital era, how accounts could be tracked, and, above all, how they could be manipulated. He had underestimated me, and the consequences of that error were going to be quite costly. It wasn't always this poisonous battleground of manipulation and treachery in my relationship with Troy. I was a computer science student, and he was a business administration student when we first met in college. He spoke of creating a future together where we would both succeed in our own industries, and he came across as pleasant and ambitious at the time. He even boasted to others about having a tech genius girlfriend, which validated my choice to focus on cybersecurity. We had a very wonderful first few years of marriage. While I rose through the ranks at many software businesses before reaching my ideal position at Bellwin Digital, Troy founded his own consulting firm, Mitchell & Associates. His interpersonal talents and my technical knowledge were a great fit. We occasionally collaborated when customers required both digital security and business strategy, and those efforts felt like the highlights of our cooperation. However, Troy's perspective on my achievement changed with time. What was once pride turned into bitterness. He began to subtly criticize me for spending too much time playing with computers and not enough time being a real wife. He would try to downplay my accomplishments if I got promotions or praise for my job, implying that I only succeeded because my male coworkers wanted to sleep with me or because businesses needed to meet diversity quotas. I was too busy to fully notice the warning signals, but they were there. Troy first appeared supportive when my mother was given a cancer diagnosis last year. He even offered to take care of our money while I was away, encouraging me to take some time off to care for her. I was appreciative of his assistance and didn't wonder why he had suddenly developed a strong interest in overseeing our investment portfolios and bank accounts. Troy claimed to have new clients who insisted on nighttime meetings, and I observed that he was working later hours more often during my mother's last months. He became more conscious of how he looked, purchasing pricey clothing and going to the gym often. He told me that he needed to seem professional to possible investors when I questioned him about it. I had total faith in him, and I had no idea that his new investor meetings were really dates with Bethany. The affair itself wasn't the most agonizing aspect. It was seeing how well he had orchestrated my demise. He was transferring money, contacting attorneys, and getting ready for a life without me, while I was hurting and defenseless. Knowing that I was too emotionally spent to keep a close eye on our finances, he had pretended that my mother was unwell in order to steal. I felt clarity, something I hadn't felt in months, as I sat in my tiny flat with my phone full of pictures from his Hawaiian honeymoon. The acute concentration that had helped me succeed in my work was replacing the fog of shock and sadness. Troy believed he had outwitted me, but he had made a critical mistake. He had overlooked the fact that every outstanding cybersecurity expert has a person behind them who knew exactly how to take advantage of flaws in both people and systems. I was well positioned to take advantage of the weaknesses his conceit and avarice had created. When I eventually went into my laptop and started following Troy's cash trail, the heartbreaking realization struck me like a physical blow. What I found made the brutality of his SMS message seem almost quaint. The theft of the bequest involved more than simply $200,000. The deliberate plunder of what we had created together over the course of 2 decades was part of a far greater scheme. I used my expertise in cybersecurity to monitor the flow of money between many accounts, timing each transfer to perfectly match my mother's overnight hospital stays or doctor's appointments. Troy had been meticulously transferring funds in sums small enough to avoid setting off automated fraud alarms, but large enough to destroy our joint assets for at least 8 months in order to plot this crime. The inheritance was only the last thing he needed. He had used falsified documents that bore my signature to cash out our joint investment accounts, deplete my retirement fund, and even take out a second mortgage on our home. While I was seeing my mother die, the man I had trusted with my financial future took over $600,000. But when I opened our old email accounts, I made the cruelest find. After more than a year of correspondence, Troy's betrayal of Bethany became evident in their interactions. They had been using my money to plan not only their affair but their entire future. Bethany's emails were filled with enthusiastic discussions about the house they would purchase, the vacations they would take, and the company they would launch together, all of which would be financed by what she jokingly called Karen's nest egg. Troy had wrote, in one especially sickening conversation, "Don't worry about the money, sweetie. She no longer even checks the accounts since she is so preoccupied with programming and taking care of her ailing mother. We'll be married and in Hawaii by the time she understands what's going on. And what will she do? Hack us?" The laughing emojis that followed indicated that they had both thought this was amusing. As I sat in the dark of my flat, my face illuminated by the illumination from my laptop screen, that final phrase replayed in my mind. How is she going to proceed? Hack us? Troy had intended it as a joke, a mocking chuckle at the notion that his computer nerd ex-wife might actually threaten their meticulously constructed utopia. I was going to show him precisely what I was capable of. Gathering proof was only the first step. I spent the remainder of the night recording everything and producing an unquestionable digital trail of Troy's larceny. In my job in cybersecurity, I had honed a few skills over the years, tools and strategies that were in the legal gray zones, strategies that were ostensibly defensive but could be used for more aggressive uses. Troy believed he was smart, but he had underestimated the lady he had deceived, which was a deadly error. He wanted to know my capabilities. I was going to demonstrate to him the difference between taking money and dealing with someone who could completely destroy it. At first, I made an effort to act morally, thinking that justice would be served by the appropriate legal processes. I phoned Phoenix's top divorce lawyer the morning after learning the full scope of Troy's larceny and outlined my case with military accuracy. I had bank records, paperwork, and a transparent paper trail that demonstrated chronic deception. The case ought to have been clear-cut. During our meeting, attorney Jennifer Hayes stated, "I understand your frustration, Mrs. Walsh, but the reality is that spousal financial misconduct cases are extremely difficult to prosecute, especially when the assets were technically joint property. Joint property that he moved without my knowledge or consent while I was caring for my dying mother," I shot out. raising my voice in a controlled rage. It will take a lot of litigation to prove that level of deceit, and even then, recovery becomes difficult if the money was spent abroad. Years of legal disputes with no assurance of victory are ahead of us. She calculated that the entire legal expenses may amount to $50,000 or more, and the consultation price alone was $500. My mother's wealth was paying for their romantic meals and couples massages, while Troy and Bethany were sharing daily updates from their paradise in Hawaii. I reported theft to the police because I had no other option. Detective Rodriguez, however, was just as depressing. I understand your predicament, Mrs. Walsh, but in actuality, your husband was legally able to access these accounts. In what seems to be a civil case, the district attorney will not press charges. Civil matter? I said it again incredulously. He forged my signature on loan documents. Are you able to demonstrate that the signatures were fake? Because his attorney will claim that you allowed him to manage money while you were attending to family matters. I contacted my brother Michael in Seattle that night in the hopes of receiving at least some emotional support. Rather, I received yet another severe blow. He continued, Karen, I don't know how to tell you this, in a reluctant tone. Troy gave me a call yesterday. He said that since Mom passed away, you've been experiencing a breakdown of some sort and that you've been leveling outrageous financial claims. He appeared to be quite concerned about you. The extent of the tampering was astounding. Troy not only embezzled my money, but also damaged my reputation by portraying me as a fragile individual experiencing a psychotic episode brought on by sadness. My reputation would be ruined and his story would be solidified by the time I could prove the theft. You know who I am, Michael. Do you think I sound unstable? Struggling to maintain a steady voice, I asked. You sound angry, he acknowledged. Look, rather of fighting, perhaps you could concentrate on mending. Troy stated that if you ceased pursuing legal action, he would be open to negotiating a settlement. A compromise? Troy intended to bargain for my acquiescence and silence in exchange for restoring a little portion of what he had stolen. In addition to being astounding, the bravado was instructive. He was sufficiently concerned about potential legal repercussions to intentionally defame me in front of my own family. Troy texted me again that evening, saying, I noticed you filed a police report. Karen, that was needless drama. I'm open to talking about a fair settlement when we return from our honeymoon. This doesn't need to be any more ugly than it is. Another picture of him and Bethany eating what appeared to be a $1,000 supper at a fancy restaurant with her engagement ring glistening in the candlelight was included. My anger and sadness were casually dismissed as unnecessary drama. This was the last straw. I spent a lot of time examining their faces in the picture. They exuded such assurance and confidence in their triumph. There was a tinge of smug satisfaction on Troy's face, as though he were enjoying both the pricey wine and the realization that he had totally outwitted his ex-wife. He thought he had won. He thought his careful planning and legal maneuvering had made him untouchable. But Troy had forgotten that I wasn't just some abandoned wife crying into her tissues. I was a cybersecurity specialist with 25 years of experience in digital warfare. And if the legal system wouldn't give me justice, I would create my own. The breakthrough came when I was analyzing Troy's digital footprint more carefully, searching for any vulnerability I could exploit. What I discovered made me realize that my husband's arrogance extended far beyond his personal betrayal. He had been running his business with the same reckless disregard for security that he'd shown in stealing from me. Mitchell & Associates wasn't just Troy's consulting firm. It was a carefully constructed house of cards built on fraudulent practices that would make my inheritance theft look like petty larceny. Using techniques I developed for penetration testing at Bellwin Digital, I gained access to his business servers and uncovered a systematic pattern of client fraud spanning nearly 5 years. Troy had been double billing clients, creating fake expenses for projects that didn't exist, and most damaging of all, selling confidential client information to their competitors. The financial records showed millions of dollars in illicit revenue, all carefully hidden through shell companies and offshore accounts. The inheritance money wasn't funding a romantic honeymoon, it was helping to hide evidence of massive corporate fraud. But the most shocking discovery was that Bethany wasn't just his secretary and mistress, she was his partner in crime. Email chains showed her actively participating in the fraudulent schemes, forging documents and coordinating with overseas contacts to launder money. Their Hawaiian honeymoon was actually a business trip to finalize the transfer of stolen funds to accounts in countries with strict banking privacy laws. As I dug deeper, I realized that Troy's betrayal of me was part of a larger exit strategy. He had been planning to disappear with Bethany and their stolen millions, leaving behind a trail of devastated clients and a wife who would be legally responsible for any business debts or criminal liability. My name was still on several of his business documents as the emergency contact and partial guarantor. The scope of their criminal enterprise was breathtaking, but it also presented an opportunity one hadn't expected. If I could expose their fraud to the right authorities, I wouldn't just recover my inheritance, I could destroy them completely. However, there was a problem. The evidence I'd gathered was obtained through methods that weren't exactly legal. Any prosecutor would throw out my findings due to how I'd acquired them, and I could face criminal charges for unauthorized computer access. I needed a way to expose their crimes without revealing my own illegal investigation. That's when I remembered the virus. 3 years earlier, I had developed a sophisticated piece of malware for a government contract, a program designed to infiltrate foreign systems and gather intelligence while appearing to be a routine software update. The project had been classified, and I'd been required to turn over all copies to federal authorities, but I had kept one backup copy on an encrypted drive, telling myself it was for academic research purposes. The virus was elegant in its simplicity. Once activated, it would systematically copy all files from infected computers and transmit them to a secure server while simultaneously creating fake system logs to cover its tracks. More importantly, it could be programmed to trigger automatically when certain conditions were met, like when the infected computers connected to specific international banking networks. I spent the next 2 days modifying the code, creating a version that would activate when Troy's laptop accessed his offshore accounts. The beauty of the plan was that the virus would make it appear as though his own criminal activity had exposed him. The same security vulnerabilities he'd created through his fraud would be his downfall. All I needed was a way to install it on his computer remotely. Fortunately, Troy's arrogance had given me the perfect opening. He was still using the same email address and passwords he'd used throughout our marriage, never bothering to change them after our separation. The final piece of my plan required patience and perfect timing. I knew from their social media posts that Troy and Bethany would be returning to Phoenix in 3 days, and Troy would immediately need to access his business accounts to manage the legitimate portions of his consulting firm. That would be my moment to strike. But as I prepared to execute my plan, an unexpected complication arose. My phone rang at 2 a.m., displaying a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice spoke in rapid, panicked sentences. "Is this Karen Walsh? You don't know me, but my name is Patricia Lewis. I'm a client of your husband's firm, and I think you need to know what he's done to us." Patricia's story was heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. She was a widow in her 70s who had hired Troy to manage her late husband's retirement investments. Over the past 2 years, he had systematically drained her accounts, claiming the money was being invested in high-yield overseas opportunities. She had only discovered the truth when she tried to withdraw funds for medical expenses and found her accounts nearly empty. "I called the police, but they said it was a civil matter," she said, her voice breaking. "He stole my husband's life insurance money, everything we worked for. I don't know what to do." "How did you get my number?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "I hired a private investigator. He found out about your situation and said there might be other victims. There are at least 6 of us that we know about, all elderly clients he's been stealing from. We can't afford lawyers, and the police won't help." The conversation lasted over an hour, and by the end, I realized that my personal revenge had become something much larger. Troy wasn't just a cheating husband who had stolen my inheritance. He was a predator, targeting vulnerable seniors, destroying the financial security of people who couldn't fight back. Patricia gave me contact information for the other victims, and over the next day, I spoke with each of them. The pattern was always the same. Troy would gain their trust, convince them to consolidate their investments with his firm, then systematically loot their accounts while providing fake statements showing fictional gains. The total theft exceeded $4 million, money stolen from people who had worked their entire lives to build modest nest eggs for their retirement years. Some of them were now facing eviction or couldn't afford necessary medications because of Troy's greed. As I listened to their stories, my anger transformed into something colder and more focused. This wasn't about personal betrayal anymore. It was about justice for people who had no other recourse. The legal system had failed them, just as it had failed me. But I had capabilities they didn't possess. I modified my virus one final time, programming it not just to expose Troy's crimes, but to systematically reverse his fraudulent transactions. The offshore accounts he'd worked so hard to hide would become the mechanism of his downfall, automatically transferring the stolen money back to his victims while simultaneously alerting federal authorities to his location and activities. The beauty of the plan was its poetic justice. Troy had used his victims' trust against them, exploiting their faith in his expertise. Now his own arrogance and technological ignorance would be his undoing. He thought he was safe in his Hawaiian paradise, but he had no idea that his next login would trigger a digital earthquake that would destroy everything he'd built. As I finalized the code, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since my mother's death. Troy had made the mistake of targeting not just me but innocent people who deserved better. He was about to learn that some fights choose you, and some enemies you simply cannot afford to make. Troy's return to Phoenix was announced with typical arrogance, a social media post showing him and Bethany at the airport, tan and relaxed, with the caption, "Back to reality." But what amazing memories we made with the money we earned. The casual cruelty of that word choice, earned, made my finger hover over the activation key for the virus. I waited until exactly 9 a.m. on Monday morning, knowing Troy's habits well enough to predict when he'd check his business accounts. My laptop showed 3 screens, one monitoring his network activity, one tracking the offshore accounts, and one displaying the FBI's financial crimes tip line, which I had already contacted with an anonymous report about suspicious international transfers from Mitchell and Associates. Troy's laptop established a connection with the First International Bank of Cayman Islands at 9:17 a.m. The virus became active immediately. The spyware replicated all of the files on his computer in a matter of minutes and started methodically undoing the fraudulent transfers that had destroyed his elderly clients. In order of the victim's financial desperation, Patricia Lewis's stolen retirement savings was restored first, then the others. Troy's own access passwords and authentication were used by the virus to make the transfers seem valid, and it operated quietly and effectively. The true genius, however, was what transpired next. The virus flagged the abrupt movement of millions of dollars as suspicious behavior and simultaneously sent off automated fraud warnings across many worldwide banking networks. Federal agents began getting real-time alerts about possible money laundering activities linked to Troy's company within 30 minutes of his login. Troy texted me, "My computer is having some issues," and my phone chimed. "Every file I have is corrupted. Do you know somebody who can help with IT issues?" It was deliciously ironic. He was requesting assistance from his ex-wife, a cybersecurity specialist, to repair the system that I had just infiltrated. I said, "Have you tried turning it off and on again?" Another text message came 20 minutes later. "Karen, this is serious. My accounts have been compromised. I require expert assistance." "That does sound serious," I said in reply. "Maybe you should call the police." The dominoes fell more quickly than I thought they would. By midday, Patricia contacted me crying, but this time she was crying with relief rather than sadness. She wept into the phone and said, "Karen, I don't understand what happened, but my money is back, everything." This morning, a message stating that the bank had found fraudulent activity and reversed the transactions simply showed up in my account. Throughout the day, the other victims made similar calls. After their stolen retirement money were miraculously recovered, elderly clients who had been on the verge of financial collapse suddenly found themselves whole again. Several intriguing leads were apparently being pursued by the FBI's financial crimes team in what they called a sophisticated international fraud scheme. Troy's texts, meanwhile, became more desperate. He wrote, The FBI is at my office. Around 3 p.m., everything is being taken by them. This is crazy. I was set up by someone. That's terrible, I said. I hope your attorney is good. They claim that I embezzled millions from customers. That isn't feasible. The funds were invested in respectable foreign ventures. Offshore investments? I responded to the SMS. That sounds difficult. Perhaps you need to have exercised greater caution when it came to your online safety. That night, the news was released. The story's title in the local media was Phoenix Business Owner Arrested in Multi-Million-Dollar Fraud Scheme. Troy didn't resemble the self-assured man in the Hawaiian beach pictures in his mugshot. His attitude was that of someone who truly couldn't comprehend how his meticulously built world had fallen apart so thoroughly. He was pale and bewildered. The next morning, Bethany was taken into custody at Sky Harbor Airport after allegedly trying to board a trip to Brazil while carrying a bag full of cash and jewelry. Only days before, her Instagram account, which had been chronicling their opulent honeymoon, was suddenly overflowing with frantic postings accusing Troy of deceiving her and asserting her innocence. Troy sent me one last text from the county jail, saying, "I somehow know this was you. You ruined me." "I'm just a grieving widow who lost her inheritance," I retorted. What on earth could I have done? Within weeks, the whole extent of Troy and Bethany's illicit scheme was exposed by the FBI inquiry. Prosecutors discovered proof of identity theft, tax evasion, money laundering, and fraud totaling more than $4 million. Their offshore financial network sophistication raised the allegations to federal racketeering breaches, indicating links to organized crime. After consenting to testify against Troy, Bethany was given an 8-year term in federal prison, while Troy was given a 15-year sentence. Their victims received a portion of the revenues from the seizure and liquidation of their assets. The funds from the sale of the Hawaiian resort they intended to buy went towards making amends. What was most satisfying was hearing that their lavish wedding, which was paid for with stolen funds, had been canceled after Bethany's evidence showed that she had been married to someone else the whole time they were together. From the start, Troy's hope for a fresh start with his young bride had been based on false information. I thought about the odd justice of it all as I sat in my tiny flat a year later, now financially stable after my inheritance was returned and I received more money from the victim's fund. I learned a crucial lesson from Troy about the nature of retaliation. Sometimes the most terrible punishment is just letting individuals deal with the fallout from their own decisions. The virus had just sped up the inevitable demise of a criminal organization founded on conceit and greed. My mother would have been pleased to learn that her daughter had managed to turn personal betrayal into a force for justice and that her inheritance had finally contributed to the restoration of 6 elderly victims' retirement money.